Well, welcome everyone today to the WoodSolutions, an Australian Institute of Landscapes Architects webinar series on wood specification and use in external applications. In the spirit of reconciliation, Forest and Wood Products Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and we acknowledge their connection to the land and their custodianship of country and forests. We pay our respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So my name's Alistair Woodard. I'm part of the WoodSolutions tech team, and I'm here emceeing today's webinar. This is the last in our series, wood in bushfire-prone areas we're covering today. So hopefully you've been part of the previous series, but you're going to enjoy today's webinar, I have no doubt. A little bit on WoodSolutions. We're an industry initiative that's resourced by Forest and Wood Products Australia. We're here to help anybody who's interested in using wood products, particularly building professionals, architects, engineers, designers, landscape architects such as yourselves. We want to inspire you to use wood products, and then if you do that, to assist you however we can with what information and resources you need to ensure you specify those correctly. So we undertake a range of activities from events, in-house tutorials, sponsorships of the mega organisations, and also production of technical information, which we generally distribute through our technical design guides, which are available through the WoodSolutions website. And hopefully if you've been part of the webinars to this point, you've been looking at some of these design guides. One key one today is our design guide number 4, building with timber and bushfire prone areas, which Boris will chat about later. So all these design guides are free. You can just need to go online, download the PDFs and bring those into your technical libraries. Also, as mentioned previously, we do webinars quite regularly. So we've obviously been running this series specifically with the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, but we do a Tuesday webinar at the start of each month, and I'll let you know about that at the end of the webinar today. Also, all our webinars are recorded, so these ones and ones we've done previously, if you want to access those, either type webinars into the search function of our website or go to the resources tab there and the link to webinars and podcasts. And as I say, you can find all of the webinars that we've run to date for AILA and others there if you want to relook at these again or let your colleagues know about them. In terms of interacting with today's webinar, if you'd like to chat amongst yourselves, just use that chat function. But more importantly, we are very keen to get your questions. So please just use the Q&A tab down the bottom there. If people like a question that's there, you can click on the thumbs up there and that'll prioritise those to the top. So we'll get through as many of those questions as we can at the end of the webinar today. Also, just a reminder, you can get informal CPD points for this webinar. So a certificate of completion will be sent to you within a week of attending the webinar. If you don't see it in your normal mail, just check your junk mail, because sometimes they can end up in that folder. Please keep the certificates in a safe place, because we can't reissue them after each webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, Boris Iskra, who's the National Standards and Codes Manager with Forest and Wood Products Australia. He holds a Bachelor of Structural Engineering degree and a graduate diploma in Building, Fire Safety and Risk Engineering. Boris has an extensive understanding of the Australian forest and wood product sector with over 30 years of direct involvement. He's also FWPA's representative on Standards Australia's technical timber committees, as well as on several built environment committees, including FP020 construction in bushfire-prone areas. Our second speaker today is Daniel Ishak, who's the Vegetation Manager Team Leader with Victorian Country Fire Authority. Daniel is an experienced environmental manager with a strong background in sustainable development, corporate and social responsibility, environmental issues, biodiversity and environmental auditing. Daniel holds a Bachelor of Forest Science and a Masters of Forest Ecosystem Science from the University of Melbourne. So as you can see, both speakers are eminently qualified to speak on today's topic of wood in bushfire-prone areas. In terms of the learning outcomes we hope you get out of today is one, an understanding of bushfire attack levels and their application to design, an understanding of the key bushfire considerations for timber structures and external appearance and landscape products, and an understanding of the concept of defendable space and the key considerations around plant selection and ongoing landscape maintenance. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass over to Boris.
Thanks, Alistair. Just get my presentation up and hopefully all things will go well. Just let me know if there's any issue, Alistair.
That's coming up. Just need to go to presentation mode.
Yeah, the computer's been a little bit slow but hopefully we'll get up there now. Has it gone into that?
It's into the mode where we're seeing you. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, thanks. And thank you everyone for your time today. I suppose what I'll do is I'll start with the presentation in relation to using wood in bushfire-prone areas. And as Elsa mentioned, I do sit on the Bushfire Standards Committee on AS 3959, and I'll be touching a bit on the use of AS 3959, as well as then moving on into the use of timber products in landscape areas. So as I mentioned, I'll basically talk about AS 3959 to an extent where it refers to bushfire attack levels, just talking about the way that is undertaken in terms of you determine a bushfire attack level and the application to design. I'll then also talk about a bushfire calculator that WoodSolutions has, our WoodSolutions BAL Calculator, and show you how that can be used from a design perspective as well. Then I'll talk about the key bushfire design considerations. I'll look at the timber structures and then move on into the appearance and landscape product areas as well. And then I also want to talk about some work that's being undertaken by the industry in bushfire testing, so some full-scale test work that will be undertaken in support of the use of timber products in bushfire-prone areas. So we're all familiar with the effects of bushfires, the devastating impacts they can have. Obviously, with our fires, our forest fires, or down to grassland fires, but also the devastation that occur within our communities. So major issues in relation to the design of our buildings in particular. And so the use of a design standard is one way that's been implemented in trying to address the sort of difficulties we have in designing for bushfire attack. So the main focus of bushfires in Australia is the use of AS 3959 as an Australian standard. It's all about construction of buildings in bushfire-prone areas. So it covers all the structure, all the attachments that can be attached to our buildings. We're currently using AS 2018 year of publication, and there are a couple of amendments that were issued for that standard. The standard is actually currently going through a review, and I'll say it's a fairly major review, and I'm happy to take questions towards the end of the presentations. But there is some further work happening. So as we learn from the effects of bushfires, that knowledge is then transferred into this particular document to try and enhance the performance of our buildings. And I suppose that's a key objective of the standard. It is about improving the ability of our buildings to withstand bushfire attack. And so therefore it does look at that whole structure. And I'll probably get onto that a bit later on, but the main objective is to prevent any embers that come from a bushfire from getting into our structure through the walls or through the roofs, and also trying to protect the inner or the internal aspects of our buildings. So preventing those embers and the radiant heat and flame contact from getting into our structures. So it does also aim to provide a level of protection to building occupants as well. I know there are differences of opinion whether or not you stay and defend or you evacuate. I suppose I'm in Victoria, so I suppose it's still fairly much up to the occupants, but they're under direction when we get to extreme fire events where occupants or residents may be asked to evacuate. So this standard is purely focused on the structure itself, so the construction options for our buildings. And it doesn't really directly apply to landscaping, although it is starting to be used in terms of the bushfire attack level, or the designation is being applied beyond that building envelope. So that's, I suppose, one of the key reasons talking about what bushfire attack levels are and how they can impact on design during today's presentations. One of the key things that I'd like to point out is with any natural event, be it a cyclone or a bushfire, there's no guarantees. So from a bushfire perspective, it all depends on the degree of vegetation and the management around the structure. Where we've got this unpredictable nature of those bushfire events. So the speed, the direction, we often hear where the wind will change, be coming in a particular direction, then change. And so all those sorts of things can have an impact on our structures. And also we have the extreme weather events that can also have a dramatic impact on buildings. So this is quite an interesting slide where we'll have a bushfire event's gone through or bushfire's gone through, and we've had destruction of some buildings, and then buildings either side or adjacent to those buildings that have been lost remain standing. So sometimes, there are reasons, and sometimes there aren't. So I suppose the unpredictable nature not only of the bushfire, but also ensuring that our buildings are being built to a reasonable standard is very important. So just in terms of what are bushfires and what are these bushfire levels. So if we look at the extreme end, and I'll work my way back to the lower levels. So obviously if we're very close to a forest where we can have our buildings directly impacted by flames, that's what under the bushfire standard is referred to as flame zone. Obviously, our structures get surrounded by fire and flames. And then as we move away from that vegetation source, the level of bushfire attack will reduce. So we have our BAL 40s moving away from the flame zone down to BAL 29, 19, and BAL 12.5. And I'll just briefly go through what are the aspects that determine or that impact on that classification. Depending on where you are in Australia, there are different fire danger indices that are nominated in the bushfire standard. So it can be anywhere down from a fire index of 40 from Queensland up to 100 here in Victoria. Also the classification type of vegetation. So anywhere from a forest down to grasslands is covered by the bushfire standard AS 3959. And a key thing was from that previous slide is the distance you are from that vegetation. The closer you are, the more impact of embers, radiant heat, as well as a potential for flame contact. But also it's the slope under the vegetation. Obviously, if you're on a flat level land, the fire will be driven by the wind. The bushfire front will be pushed towards the structures. As that slope starts to increase, the bushfire then starts to ramp up speed and can then obviously potentially cause flames to then engulf or impact on the buildings. So slope is also important as part of the classification in terms of what the bushfire attack level is. So we talk about these numbers, from BAL 12.5 up to flame zone. Under the bushfire standard, there are certain objectives that have been linked to those bushfire attack levels. So 12.5 is basically a level of heat or radiant heat, 12.5 kilowatts a square metre. So that's the assumption that at that level you get 12.5 kilowatts a square metre onto your structure. It's basically predominantly looking at ember attack, and I suppose one of the keys of the or the key objective is to at this point you potentially get some anneal glass or traditional glass to fail at that level of heat. And so the design of the buildings is to try and minimise the impacts of the radiant heat onto our buildings and try and minimise the effects of that heat or embers penetrating our buildings. So then the BAL 29 is obviously an increase in radiant heat, and the key objective there is we start to utilise some sort of screens over that glazing, the anneal glass, to provide some additional level of protection. And there are other ways that this is, I suppose, one of the key ways that those bushfire attack levels were developed. BAL 29 is, I suppose, one of the key levels where timber can achieve performance under the bushfire standard. It's basically viewed as having this 29 kilowatts a square metre on the timber, and the timber over time will then self-ignite under that radiant heat condition. Then when we get into those extreme levels of BAL 40, we start to have, we've now built up a lot greater knowledge than we did in the past. We've had some major bushfire events where there's been a lot of learnings taken from that, and the bushfire standard has been compared against the performance and actually found to perform quite well when constructed in accordance with the standard. And the most extreme area, as I mentioned earlier, is the flame zone. So basically at the flame zone end, it's basically full scale or tested systems that we use. So what do these numbers mean? Yes, you can understand that there's an increasing radiant heat and risk. If we look at the lowest level, the BAL 12.5, at 10 kilowatts a square metre, you would feel pain in 3 seconds. So it's quite a dramatic amount of heat, even at the lowest level of BAL assessment. So to try and assist people and designers in looking at what BAL would be applicable for their buildings, and there's a calculator that's based on the bushfire standard. So this WoodSolutions Bushfire Calculator, and we basically aligned the calculator with the simplified pathway in the bushfire standard. So basically you select the fire danger index, depending on where you are in Australia, the type of vegetation, as I said, either from a forest vegetation classification down to grasslands. You can input the distance, that your building is from that vegetation. Also inserting the slope under that vegetation. And then you simply hit calculate and you get a range of different bushfire attack level assessments done. The neat thing with this calculator is where you've got an area, particularly obviously in regional areas where you can potentially move your structure around. The calculator also breaks it down. Not only does it give you the bushfire attack level for your input, but also says, okay, well, if your distance was further, that gives you the various distances that your building will need to be to achieve the various bushfire attack levels. So it's quite a very good calculator in order to just get a feel for the location of structures and how you can look at potentially reducing the bushfire attack level on your structure. So look, that's a bit enough about the background and the setting up of the bushfire attack level or determining the classification. So once you've done that, what timbers can I use? So as I mentioned, AS 3959 basically just focuses on the structure. It doesn't go beyond that building envelope. So within the structure, you can basically use whatever timber type you want to use. So all the framing elements can be used because you're within that building envelope. So a bushfire wants to get into our structure. So by providing some protection via our external envelope, we can provide protection to our internal elements. So in effect, within that building envelope, you can basically use whatever timbers you like. It's when we move externally, obviously where we're now in the direct line of sight of a bushfire. The AS 3959 provides a breakdown of external species. And again, just sort of trying to be clear that this is all about the building. I'll get on to landscaping in a moment, but the standard is, I suppose, the document that people are now using to try and extend to external applications as well. But so if we're looking at on a building, external wall cladding can be used by these. You can use these species for external wall cladding, but also for decking type applications. That was in that 12.5 and 19 range. We have a suite of species that are listed as achieving up to and including the BAL 29 classification, but there's basically just 7 hardwoods as a deemed to comply solution. So these are naturally occurring timbers with no additional treatments done to them. So, but if we don't want to use those species, or we want to do something else, there is an ability to actually undertake some testing. And this is, I suppose, leading into where industry is going with some of its work at the moment. So there's a specific test for bushfire resisting timbers that's nominated in the bushfire standard. And so basically you can look at, it could just be the natural inherent properties of the material, such as those 7 hardwoods, or you can look at impregnation systems, and some of those have now come to market. So these timbers will be impregnated by some sort of fire retardant treatment to enhance their bushfire performance. And you can look at also application of fire retardant coating systems to those timbers as well. So there are some products in the market. If you're wanting to do some moving into this full-scale test space, you can basically build a rig or a sample of what you're proposing to build. So it could be a deck, could be a window, could be wall cladding. The bushfire standard stipulates for the various bushfire attack levels during a test what heat you need to achieve or need to be applied to that building element. So you'll note that basically starting at time 0 of the test, and depending on what bushfire attack level, there's a predetermined heating regime that needs to be applied to that sample or that specimen. So right up to this BAL 40, and the test standard is AS 1530 Part 8, Part 1. So for the next step, which is an extreme area, it's when we're looking at flame zone systems. Basically, this is a standard fire test that's done for building elements. So in high-rise buildings would be tested to this system, although there's a defined time that the test is undertaken. So a 30-minute test, and then you're followed by 60-minute monitoring. So there's all this sort of monitoring done that the structure or the element doesn't over time heat up, or that heat transfer and cause sort of breaking down of that element. So there has been some test work done by Forest and Wood Products Australia. In the early days, when we had these 7 hardwoods, there was a lot of jarrah and carry decking that was being used, and unfortunately couldn't be used in the BAL 29 region because it wasn't nominated as one of the timber species that could be used. So there's a test undertaken looking at a timber deck. And I suppose one of the key things here is that the jarrah decking did actually pass the test. It achieved this BAL 29, but in effect, one of the key things is that it need to be enclosed underside. So to prevent the heat getting in from underneath, and also burning debris, which are simulated by a crib. So there's a timber crib that's placed in under the deck if it was an unenclosed deck. And so that's where trying to simulate where leaves and burning debris gets in underneath the deck and causes a fire from below. So the testing can be done, and you can come up with some timber solutions where they are currently not nominated in the bushfire standard. So there are, so that was for enclosed deck scenarios. There are other ways of achieving enclosed decks using compliant timber species to clad the underside of the deck, or using some sort of corrugated metal or even fibre cement sheet. So there are also ways of achieving that enclosure under the bushfire standard as well. I mentioned earlier that there are fire retardant coating systems that can be applied. One of the key things is just request copies of test certificates for those. Sometimes they'll be tested with some timbers and not with others. So it's very important to just ask for those test certificates. Now, I suppose BAL 40, and I mentioned BAL 29 is where timber tends to be cut out, but there has been some further work that has taken some timber products beyond BAL 29 up to BAL 40. Basically, this is a full-scale test, as I mentioned earlier, with a radiant heat up at that 40 kilowatts a square metre. So there are now some fire retardant impregnated systems that are available that have been tested to that AS 1530 Part 8 Part 1 test. Now, when you're doing a fire retardant treatment, it does need to go through a weathering process, which these companies have, or this particular company has done. And I know there are other products that are coming onto market as well. So it's a very involved test that needs to be passed, and it's very difficult to pass it. So having products like this also expands the ability of your being able to use timber products externally. Now, the flame zone, there has been some full-scale work, and I won't sort of touch base a lot on this. There are some state bodies, be they fire services or even local government authorities, that don't like to use timber in these extreme ends, or they don't want construction. But I suppose the point I was trying to make here is that there are systems that have been tested that have passed the test. At the end of the test, you're basically up at 840 degrees C, and it's just a constant increase in temperature. Now, under the bushfire standard, that particular wall system has been applied to BAL 29, even though it achieved flame zone. And that's just because the committee was a little bit, I suppose, reticent in trying to promote the use of systems beyond the BAL 29 from a timber perspective. Now, landscaping applications. So there's a range of applications that you'd be familiar with where timber is wanting to be used. So looking at sort of areas around garden beds or fencing, I suppose some of the key things to try and improve the performance of structures is looking at hard surfaces around elements that then prevents, we don't get the buildup of vegetation growing around pathways such as these steps. We also want to use timber across waterways and paths and fences. And I'll talk briefly about that as well in terms of some of the research work that we're now undertaking in trying to support the use of timber products. So there's a full-scale timber fencing and sleeper project that's being undertaken. There are some guides around the country that sort of put some limitations on the use of timber. So this research project is trying to understand if there really need to be some limitations, or if there are some better designs that could be done to enhance the performance. So from a testing perspective, the industry is doing what it can to try and utilise timber products in a safe way in bushfire areas. But both buildings and landscape design can be improved by looking at how we maintain the external site. And Daniel will talk a bit more about this in a moment. From a bushfire perspective, it's trying to minimise the vegetation and particularly mulching around walls or building elements. Obviously, if we have mulch that's a combustible mulch, then it can impact both on buildings or on landscape materials. So hard surfaces are sort of promoted to try and improve the performance, but also maintaining the house and the block around the structure. So trying to maintain grassed areas, minimising leaf and debris on a bushfire a day or a high bushfire risk day. So that will all enable enhancement of the performance of buildings, but also making sure that key actions are taken on those high risk days to try and minimise the impacts on our structures and elements around our landscaping elements around our buildings. But one of the difficulties that we have with a bushfire stand is that you can control what you can on your own block, but your neighbours could also impact on your building and structures. So it's working closely in your neighbourhood as well to try and improve the performance of our building elements. So Elsa did mention earlier that there's a design guide, and so under their woodsolutions.com.au website, so as a free download, you can get a lot of the information about building structures and the bushfire resisting timbers, and it's got details in there for deck design and construction in that guide as well. So look, I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll get some questions, and I can hopefully respond to that towards the end of Daniel's presentation. So thanks everyone. Let me just get out of that. There we go.
Thanks, Boris. And Daniel, if you want to fire up your screen.
No worries, shall do. All right, hopefully that's worked. Perfect. All right. Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for having me along too, Alistair. So yeah, everyone, Dan is my name, just from CFA, I'm Veg Management Team Leader, as Alistair introduced. And I've been invited today to speak to Landscaping for Bushfire, a document, a series of docs that we'll develop in CFA. So I'll kick off and do that. And as Boris said, happy to take questions at the end. I also have a bit of a cold at the moment, so I do apologise if I'm coming across a little bit husky. But just for me, for today, do a bit of a basic, a bit of an overview. Initially, we'll do a basic background around fire behaviour and fuels, talk to defendable space and some of the enablers in Victoria, landscaping for bushfire products, plant selection, regular and ongoing maintenance, as well as just highlight some case studies that have where this has been applied, and also future works we're working on around the landscaping with bushfire products. So kick off first with a bit of fire behaviour. I'm not too sure about everyone's knowledge in here. I know bushfire attack levels is heavily influenced by some of this fire behaviour and intensity. But just from me, fire is a natural part of the Australian environment. We've obviously seen a few in 1920s, some big fires across Australia, etc. But it is a natural part of the environment, which is probably changing a bit through climate. But fire has three elements: fuel, heat and oxygen, the fire triangle, little picture there. And fire behaviour and the intensity is driven by three key items, which is the fuel, so the vegetation available, the topography, slope of the ground, etc., as well as the weather. So winds, relative humidity, a whole bunch of things. And these all work together to influence the intensity and how the fire behaves in the landscape. Out of these sort of two, I guess, the fire triangle and intensity and behaviour, the one thing we can manage is fuels, which is really the vegetation through planning and maintenance. And this is where bushfire attack levels come in, but also where landscaping, bushfire and plant selection play a key part in this prevention of bushfires and trying to minimise intensity to be able to make suppression of bushfires easier and also protect assets. So fuels or vegetation. Fuels within the landscape and the availability to burn is determined by the fuels or the vegetation's characteristics. So this is such as fuel type, so trees, shrubs or heath, grass and herbs, leaf litter and organic soils, which links back to how we design our landscapes around our properties, as well as the fuel arrangement. If the fuel is elevated, so I was trying to work out how to use a pointer, but I'm not a Zoom guru. So anyway, the elevated fuel, this bark fuel, surface fuel, and near surface, which you can see in that little image on the bottom right hand there. It is also heavily influenced by the compaction of the fuel. So if the fuel is very dense, as well as also the vertical or horizontal arrangement of the fuel influences the fire behaviour. As well as a big one that will influence fire behaviour and also how we do landscaping, try to minimise some of that fire behaviour, is fuel moisture, the moisture content within the plant or within the vegetation. The availability to burn, as I mentioned earlier, is heavily influenced by the weather and the season, and also where positioned in the landscape, which aspect of the landscape vegetation is positioned, because northern aspects often drier, whereas your southern aspects are often more moist and you have a lot more vegetation and ability to grow in those aspects. So all of these things need to be taken into account where we think about defendable space. So you looked at Boris talked about BAL 12.5, 40, etc. A lot of that will also be influenced by the defendable space to be able to get that BAL ratings. But the key principle for landscaping is establishing a defendable space around a built infrastructure. So when I say built infrastructure, it could be houses, could be sheds, could be anything that you determine to be of value. And what you need to do is remove flammable objects from around that house, or if to maintain the defendable space. But also, if you do have stuff within that that defendable space, something that is likelihood of ignition is a lot less. So a defendable space should reduce the likelihood of house loss, with a house generally surviving a fire front if the fire intensity in the immediate vicinity is low to moderate, with fuel management a key function of this. So if you had vegetation right up to the house, you'd almost be in flame zone, you'd have very intense fire near your property. So to help assist in this, appropriate landscaping and plant selection is key to help establish this defendable space. When we talk plant selection, even down to, like you can see in those images, grass in an open grassed area, mown, is still part of your landscaping influence around your defendable space there too. And once you do establish these gardens or open area, maintenance is critical, and timing of maintenance is always critical as well. If it's always lovely to install and make it look fantastic, but if you don't maintain it ongoing, you can get a lot of growth, and that increases fuel loads and can increase likelihood of ignition as well as potential impact on property. In Victoria, under the planning scheme, we have, we have bushfire-prone areas and bushfire moderation overlays, which contains exemptions for veg removal and establishment of defendable space. So in a bushfire-prone area is a 1030 rule, and in a bushfire management overlay a 1050 rule, which allows for removals of trees up to 10 metres and then vegetation up to either 30 or 50 metres, depending on down to shrub layer, depending on where you are. And this is all enabled through the Victorian Government Planning Scheme. There are some local laws you still have to be aware of before just thinking you can go holeless, bolus, clear out vegetation, but it is an enabler under our planning schemes. So there's a bit of pre-intro around, I guess, bushfire and more fire behaviour, defendable space, and how they link together into our landscaping for bushfire products, which is around how we do landscaping with bushfire in mind to try to reduce the likelihood of property loss and fires taking hold. So after the so guidance documents were developed back in 2012 through consultation with a number of sector partners. So that was within the fire sector as well as in the environmental sector, and I call it the landscaping sector. The product got released at the Victorian Garden Show, so it was linked definitely into that landscaping sphere and horticultural sphere. It was developed post the 2009 Bushfire Royal Commission. From some of the findings that were from there around what was built around properties, etc., helped contribute to property loss. And in 2022, last year, it was reviewed with some minor updates. For instance, there were some updates in the planning scheme, but also some just general updates around some of the plant selection criteria and species attributes we had in there. The document itself has 7 sections, with the majority are transferable across Australia, but the preamble in sections 1 are really Victorian specific. But the plant selection key is transferable all across Australia, with, I will touch on later, but with Western Australia at the moment looking at developing something similar and using one of our selection tools with the plant selection key initially developed by research from around the world of what's been happening there, and drawing on some of the leading stuff in Canada around what they're doing in this space as well. But today, I'll focus on the maintaining a garden section, which is section 6 within that document, and the plants key and plant selection, which is in section 5 and 7. If you jump online and just search landscaping for bushfire, you should come across it on the CFA website, but otherwise there is a link in this slides, which I think may get shared, but otherwise jump online and have a look. Supporting these documents, supporting this larger document is also garden design documents, which we'll put together around coastal garden, suburban garden, rural garden, and hills garden, understanding they're all different. They're all in different parts of the greater the landscapes, greater like landscape on a scale of Australia landscape, not down to the around your household landscape. And there's a bit of guidance in there, and also some species selections as well for these 4 model gardens designs. So they're available too if you jump on to have a look as well. So within the landscaping for bushfire document, there's a plant selection key, with going through the document, this key is in the back and can be used to determine your traits or characteristics from your tree and how your plants actually and their flammability. But there also is an online interactive portal where you can go through. It's been updated 3 months ago because it did have a couple of glitches just through updating of software, etc. But as I mentioned before, plants have a lot of traits that influence their flammability and suitability for landscaping and bushfire risk areas. Okay, the plant selection key is a practical tool developed to guide you in choosing your plants. It won't go down to the species name, what to choose, but it'll talk through the characteristics like go, no go, so to speak. As I mentioned, there's an interactive version as well as static. And the key has a series of questions and info about what plant characteristics and how it relates to their relative flammability. The key, the process will give you an overall flammability rating for your plants, a fire-wise rating. It'll give you advice about maintenance. It'll give you advice about whether a plant is appropriate for your garden too. So it'll go through to go through that as you go through it and give you sort of like a choose your own adventure, I guess, if you go through it and have a look. So around flammability, I thought I'd just do a quick chat to flammability in regards to plants and what the document refers to it as, and also the what influences. So plant flammability varies depending upon plant's traits or characteristics, but it's also dependent on the age of the plant, the health of the plant, physical structure, and the chemical content of the plant, which I'm sure majority of people are fully across, etc. So, but just sort of highlight that one. Flammability depends on the daily and seasonal variations. So obviously, if it's a hotter day, the plant has probably expired a lot more moisture through its leaf content. So there's a lot, its moisture content is a fair bit lower than it would be in other parts of the day. I mentioned earlier about aspect, etc. So the location of plant is within the landscape influences flammability, as well as how it's surrounded by other vegetation, any other flammable objects too. So if it's in shade, etc., it'll be holding a lot more moisture. Growth might be a bit denser. And also what part of the plant, depending on the plant as well, some parts will be more flammable, particularly like small branches, etc., that have died off, will be a lot more flammable than live lush foliage. So this needs to be kept in mind when developing or reviewing a landscape plan. And so when I say developing, it's the initial build and what you put in the landscape, but also reviewing down the track about what worked, what didn't work, and what might need to be replaced through your garden maintenance program. So plant selection. So what I'll go through here now is pulled from the document. If you haven't seen it, have a look at it. If you are aware of it, if you have used it, you're probably aware of what I'm about to present. But a big thing about the landscaping and part of the document is a plant selection key, which I mentioned earlier, and how to choose suitable plants. So I've spoken a bit about characteristics of plants and influence flammability, but a big one, which is one of the hardest ones to really track and monitor a lot of the time, is because there's so many variations in a day that influence the plant, but is moisture content. So it's very complex and depends on a number of interaction factors, which I mentioned earlier, such as time of day, the season, the part of the plant, where the plant is planted, so aspect, as well as the age. So that's but it's a big component of it. Branching patterns too. So when you are looking at developing landscape plans or landscape designs, and you are within a high bushfire risk area, you've probably had a BAL assessment put across, etc. And know where it's best to not have vegetation in, or if it is, you have to have vegetation that is less likely to carry fire. A critical thing is branching pattern. So branching pattern influences the distribution and density of the foliage within a plant, as you can see in those images there. You'll want to choose plants that are open and loosely branching with leaves that are thinly spread. Closely packed leaves have more fuel available, for instance, that cypress looking one on the left-hand side, as well as also wanting plants that have a fair bit of separation from the ground. So if a fire did come through, be it even a lower intensity fire, it'd be able to move under the plants. So that's coming up a bit later, and that also does relate to maintenance as well. Another big thing is texture. Is plants with a coarse texture have a lower surface area to volume ratio, making them less flammable than plants with a fine texture. So it takes a lot longer to preheat. There's more water content within them. So that's always useful. Density, plants which are dense are often more flammable as there is a higher fuel load available to burn, as you can see in some of the images there on the right-hand side. So a much denser, more clump plant will burn a lot readily. Also, we talk about ember attack under BAL. They're more likely to pick up a lot more embers. The embers are more likely to sit in them, smoulder, and then ignite the plant. You can see on the right, the left-hand side there, a bit of density down the bottom, very dense up to the top, a little bit more sparse. This can also be influenced by pruning and maintenance as well to maintain less density in some of those canopies. Okay, other characteristics that influence plant flammability are the leaves. So when you are looking at landscaping, what plant decisions to put in there, the leaves. So the fineness and shape of the leaves affect their flammability. Wide, flat, thick leaves, and those with soft and fleshy tissue, fleshy often have more plant, more tissue within the plant. So therefore more moisture, also a higher surface area ratio too. The finer leaves have a higher surface area ratio, such as needles, etc., within the plants, and so they dry out quicker. They don't ray out quicker. My apologies on that one, but they dry out quicker, and then they become more available to ignite quicker. So if you have a lower intensity fire passing through those, they're more likely to dry out, ignite, than if you went through with the same fire went under a more succulent sort of plant structure. Bark type is another big influencer, huge influencer. Some barks are more readily to burn. So loose bark, which you can see on the right-hand side there, such as a manna gum, etc., is more prone to ignition and will move through the air as an ember, whereas compact, dense bark is less prone to ignition. So on the left-hand side, sorry, my bad, down the bottom there, it's a box gum, which is much more compact, less likely to bark to burn and carry as an ember and impact your house, which will influence BAL rating, ember attack as well. So good linkages there. And another couple last big things here before I'll talk to some maintenance components is oils, waxes, and resins really influence flammability. So some chemicals found naturally in plants will increase flammability. Some of your finer leaf plants, such as some of your melaleucas, etc., will often contain a lot of oils. So it's sort of a double whammy. They'll see in some of the finer leaf acacias as well, but they will preheat to a point where they can ignite, and then they'll ignite. But when they do ignite, they're full of oils too. So the behaviour from them is much more intense and a lot more radiant heat coming out of them because of the oils which are contained within those leaves. And have mentioned a couple of times, but the retention of dead material. So dead leaves, branchlets retained in the plant or accumulated on the ground will increase flammability. A dry fuel to get it to ignition point is a lot quicker than a greener fuel, etc. So they will ignite, and then they'll also, the heat to heat transfer from an ignited leaf to ignited twig, etc., to another one will move a lot quicker if it's dry too. So regular pruning is often required, as well as underneath your vegetation, raking it out, and also mentioned earlier by Boris is when you are doing your landscaping, particularly around your buildings, etc., it's not to use mulches, etc., because it's combustible material, even though it can be slow smouldering. When they become available for a fire, bushfire, they're often dry unless you've been wetting them down. So landscape maintenance, not just of the plant, but in general. So ongoing maintenance is critical for built assets, such as your house, sheds, as well as your garden. Regular maintenance will reduce the likelihood of house loss. You can see in that top image there, gravel around the property with mowing grass out to vegetation out further afield, just maintaining the weeds, etc., in your grass, or particularly up around your property or your house, etc. House is good if they're dry and ember gets that will combust, so you have got yourself some trouble. Even in the bottom image, just having position within your landscapes, shields, I guess, or protected areas that'll when a fire did come through, that'll minimise the radiant heat, which could potentially ignite what's on the other side of it, which you can see in that bottom right hand side image. So the frequency of how you maintain the garden, or you will depend on the type of garden, if you have, and also depend on availability of time to do it. But as a minimum, it should be once a year prior to bushfire season to maintain your defendable space. But often, if you have more time, etc., you maintain it a lot better, which means maintain it more frequency, which means the bulk of the work to do it towards the start of fire season is less, and you don't have a whole bunch of stuff to get to the green waste tip or try to burn off before you come into fire season. Because if you've done it as you've come into a fire danger period, you won't get a permit to be able to actually burn off that vegetation you removed. As you're doing your landscape, your maintenance, replacing planting will need to be considered, as well as suitability. So if you have did plant, say, 5 years ago, when conditions may not have been coming through the drought, or particularly through the wet cycle we've had, you might have found that some of the plants selected didn't survive as you had thought. So look at what you could be suitably replaced there, and also forecasting ongoing conditions into the next few years. Disease stressed or dead plants are often more flammable, so make sure they get removed, or remove the disease dead components, because as per some of the plant characteristics, you've lost your moisture in them, so they become a lot more availability. Another big thing, I guess, into the future is changing climate will influence your plant mortality and therefore selection. So if you are doing plant selection through your design, think potentially about the future of what the upkeep of those plants are going to need, and the likelihood to maintain that upkeep if we do go into water restrictions, etc. And if the designed area hasn't got woodsuds or any kind of water retention ability in there. And also another thing too, through time, is just new species development. There's often new plants that are coming out, and so there's potential for substitution over time of those plants, or even what you've historically put in a general landscape to do there as well. There's a lot of things that can work together. No one solution for everything. So for your regular maintenance, touched on a few of these, but actions can include removal of dead, dying or diseased plants and replace. Note species change may occur, like I mentioned earlier. Pruning of plants to remove removal of dead material within plant structure, so it keeps it more open. As I mentioned earlier, if an ember does land in there, the likelihood to get to ignition is a lot longer on green foliage than it would be on dead foliage. Pruning of your plants to remove or reduce some biomass within that plant structure, the head, be it formative pruning, etc. And therefore you're removing more of the flammable material within that plant. Clear from underneath the plants or around the house and assets, just so even debris flow onto it, etc. from any of your plant vegetation, move it away, because that is the stuff that will ignite and transfer into your property and burn down an asset, etc. Prune plants with low-hanging branches, creating vertical separation from the ground. Preference is greater than 2 meters above ground, people say above ground, but also below plant strata. So if you've got a fair bit of stepping through your landscape or tiering, just make sure you maintain that separation. As I mentioned earlier, if a fire comes through, it minimises what we'll call, I guess, a ladder fuel of the fire being to come from the lower strata up into your upper strata there too. I do believe there is some reference to that in some of the Australian standards for vegetation too. Replace or cover organic mulch with non-flammable mulches, so rocks, pebbles, etc. Put across seashells, mulch, mussel shells, things along those lines. Replace it with that, particularly up against your built infrastructure, like that top picture there too. That can be put over, and then if you want to remove it for aesthetics over the winter periods and put mulch back on across there to get a bit more organic matter back into the ground, you can. Just need to rotate how you do that. Remove weeds. Weeds always come and, remove them. They'll often, I guess, be a bit of an annual, shorter lived cycle. die, and then there'll be a fuel available there. And another one too, I guess, is burning of the plants pre-bushfire season. So there are a lot of landscapes that will have grasses within them. I particularly reflect on, say, poas or something like that, or stipers, or any sort of grass like that, which has a lot of biomass in the top. Is burn them off as one of your maintenance mechanisms. You burn them down to a grass, very, very neat little sward. The risk has been reduced into the summer because you remove that above ground biomass. They'll often also get a lot more fresh green pick on them when they go into the season. So the time to bring that to ignition is a lot longer than it would be for just a normal dead long living biomass on it. And even when you prune those species, you tend to retain a lot of stuff within them. So coming towards the end here, so thank you for the time, but there's been a few things that have been happening in this space. There's a case study developed called the Sedum Landscaping for Bushfire case study, which is available online, about how people have they landscape their property, particularly down to probably a level, a lot of succulents around the house, etc. When they had a fire come through, it actually helped maintain that property from getting impact, but they also maintained a visual aesthetic around their property instead of being gravel all around it. That made it was a balance between protection from bushfire as well as also maintaining the aesthetic around their property. We're working in local governments to develop some examples, putting around some of their nurseries, etc., to try to talk to some of these more less flammable species to plant in very fire-prone communities. There's some brigades that have actually got example gardens around their property, talking to those sort of, I guess, more moisture content, larger leaf species within there, maintaining the separation from the ground to the canopy. We're also working with Western Australia to develop a guidance around what they're doing there too, something similar to this landscaping of bushfire, but they are drawing on our plant selection criteria and going to be using it within their materials they develop. And there are also books that are being developed around this subject matter. You can see that Safer to Garden. This one I'm not promoting it because it's nothing. I won't do that to promote it, not self-promote, promote it. But that document, that book has actually listed some of the flammability aspects of particular plants and does reference landscaping for bushfire in there. Whereas I said that landscaping for bushfire goes through traits. So if you know what you want to plant, you can go through that to see the suitability of that within an area you are. And that brings me to the end of my session. So thanks, Alistair, and I'll throw to yourself and then out to the audience for questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. All right, so people online, if you've got some questions, fire them in now. Pardon the pun. We've got a few minutes to cover off on a couple of these. Boris, question here from Matteo. Has Australian radiata pine been tested at different BAL levels? And for those tested accounted for grades related to density, size, thickness and treatment?
Look, at the early stages when the bushfire standard was first being introduced, there was a whole lot of test work that was done. From memory, it was over 30 different species that were tested, and radiata pine was one of those. And it didn't achieve, this was for that bushfire resisting timber status. But there was a whole lot of work that was done, and like I say, just didn't meet that BAL 29 level. AS 3959 for the lower bushfire attack levels of 12.5 and 19 just bases it on density. So radiata pine has an average density of around between 5 to 550 kilograms a cubic metre. So it doesn't quite meet the density to enable it to go all the way, say as an external wall cladding, all the way down to ground level. At the 12.5 and 19, if that lower 400 millimetres is of one of those bushfire resisting timbers or a higher density, you can use a radiata above that 400 mil level. So there is ways of using radiata pine, but the bushfire standard is all about densities. When you start looking at deck applications, you tend to have to use a higher density material or one of these impregnated fire retardant treated products.
Yep. Thanks, Boris. Daniel, I was just wondering, just recognising that our audience here is quite national, so CFA in Victoria has produced some great guidelines. I assume the other state fire authorities have some similar guidelines that people can Google online?
I'm not too sure, to be honest. I know I mentioned earlier, Western Australia is looking at developing something similar. They are going to be using that same plant selection key. So they do have that. RFS have some bushfire programs with the communities and the landholders to be able to understand potential fire in their landscape, which does include the landscaping down around their property, but I think it more also relates to the vegetation in general around their property. So I can't talk holistically. I just know my main one is WA are producing something.
Okay, I certainly think there's a New South Wales and a Queensland one if people in those states just want to follow up their fire authorities.
Yeah.
Boris, a question here from Maritza. Does the AS 3959 revision include updated rate of spread equations to align with bushfire behavioural science by emergency agencies?
Yeah, look, there's a whole lot of work happening in that assessment space. So looking at the vegetation and I can't quite remember how I term that, but there is work being done in both the classification for bushfire attack level as well as the construction side. So yes, basically that whole bushfire standard is being reviewed and trying to align with best knowledge, I suppose the easiest way to say it.
All right, well, that's fantastic. We're just on one now. So thanks, Boris and Daniel. They were both fascinating presentations. I definitely learned a lot from both of them. I just remind those online that Boris mentioned about technical design guide number 4, building with timber in bushfire prone areas. WoodSolutions has a number of other tech design guides which were relevant to the series, and you can get all those from our woodsolutions.com.au website. So look, this was the last of our series of 5. We hope you found these webinars of value and interest. I remind you again, if you missed one or you want to see these again or pass them on to your colleagues, you can access these recorded webinars at the WoodSolutions events page under webinars and podcasts. So a little bit different to this group, but as I mentioned, we do continue to hold our monthly WoodSolutions webinar. Actually, our next one's around resilient timber homes, so a bit of an extension of the discussion we've had today, but also looking at how we build our timber homes in bushfire, flood-prone and cyclone areas. And Paolo Levici from WoodSolutions will be speaking about that one. So if you'd like to view that one, just register online. So look, thank you all once again. It's been a great webinar series. We've really enjoyed presenting it to you. We hope you found some value from it, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our WoodSolutions webinars in the future. Have a great day, everyone.